unpack here with our legal panel. Shannon Bream, by the way, Fox News, and not only the chief legal correspondent, but also now the new host of Fox News Sunday. Congratulations, Shannon. We also have Fox News contributor Jonathan Turley, former federal prosecutor Katie Cherkasky. Let me start with you, Katie. What stands out immediately and most significantly to you?
Well, of course, the DOJ is going to try to make this sound as bad as possible, but I think we're still not getting at the bottom line here. President Trump was the classification authority. He had the right to declassify any information that was in his possession during his time as president. The fact of the matter here is that I think the words espionage, classified, SCI are being used without any sort of actual facts to support what he's supposed to these documents. In my opinion, the fact that he had these documents in his possession is no crime at all, regardless of what Merrick Garland or the DOJ says.
Shannon, Donald Trump, former President Trump, actually tweeted to that. Number one, it was all declassified. Number two, they didn't need to seize anything. They could have had it at any time they wanted without playing politics and breaking into Mar-a-Lago. It was in a secured storage with an additional lock put on it as per their request. A lot of confusion about that. The president, the chief executive office, the executive branch, doesn't he have the power to declassify these things? Didn't he make sweeping declassifications while he was in office?
Yeah, and that's been the argument from his supporters. They say this is something that the president alone, as the commander-in-chief, has a lot of authority over. Here's the thing, though. There's something that happened between June when they were having those conversations, seemed like things were going well with negotiations between the former president's legal team and the government. Then when they went at the beginning of August and got this warrant, which, again, the magistrate there gave them until August 19th to execute it. And that raises questions, too, if this was urgent national security, why those lags in time? The questions we have, the answers we don't have, because they're in those underlying documents, the affidavits that will not be released today. There are a number of media outlets and Judicial Watch who are trying to get to those documents. They filed actual motions to unseal them. The magistrate in this case has given the government until Monday at 5 o'clock to answer to those. That is where the real meat of this case is, where the really interesting stuff is. Everything sworn under oath that was given to that judge to essentially justify the warrant. That's what we want to get our hands on. We'll see if this judge is open to that argument.
Yeah, Jonathan, not only did there seem to be a lack of urgency since this was granted on August 5th at 12 o'clock noon, and not only was there not a sense of urgency, but when they arrived with at least 30 FBI agents. And you know, there seems to be parallel stories here. The media narrative, which is a lot of speculation, and then the bits and pieces that we're starting to get. Can you put it together for us?
Well, it's difficult to put it together in a consistent narrative. It's like watching two different movies at the same time. The Trump team has said that we were cooperating. We did cooperate with the subpoena. There was a request to add a lock to the storage. We complied with that request. The government is suggesting that this could be a violation of the Espionage Act. I mean, those are very different accounts. There's a lot that we have to learn. The affidavit would give us a lot of that information. But the glaring questions really concern that period of time. After this defense was raised, I assume the Trump people said that they declassified material. Did the Department of Justice say that we disagree? And did they offer to remove the documents to a secure facility while they worked that out? Did the Trump team simply tell them to pound sand, that they weren't going to turn anything over? That's what would be in the affidavit. But the other thing that's a little curious about this is, in fact, the delay with TSSCI material. You know, this material comes with covers that clearly delineate this level of classification. When something's declassified, you literally physically scratch out or put a line through the classification. Now, what's a little bit odd about this circumstance is we know that in those hectic days at the end of the term following January 6th, there was an effort to declassify material. It's not clear if staffers, first of all, if the president declassified all this material, but also whether staffers went in and made those notation changes on these documents. So there could be confusion over the status of these documents.
And to that point, Katie, not only was there, a lot of questions about the urgency with respect to the warrant, but the documents themselves, the materials themselves, 19 months. I mean, if they were so detrimental, so important that there was this sort of urgency, you had 19 months, and All of a sudden, just out of nowhere, it became this huge priority where the Trump team was apparently, not engaged anymore, and the FBI went in. What do you make of that?
Well, it does seem somewhat like a setup at this point. I mean, this was the president of the United States. Of course, he had access to classified and sensitive information. And any comparison to any other government employee is completely irrelevant to the president. The president is not bound by the same regulations and laws that any other government employee is when they have these security clearances. TS and SCI information can run the gamut from a lot of different topics. So it's really, I think, a fear factor sort of thing that the left and the media are trying to go after in terms of using these terms without any sort of substance to tell us what do they actually mean by that. He had access to classified documents. Did he declassify them? There's not a specific process for the classification authority, the president, to actually do that. Does he need to annotate on the document to indicate such? Likely, yes, but there's really no prescribed method he has to go through. So I think that we have a lot of big questions here about the actual criminal acts that they're saying he engaged in. And it's got to be much more than him just possessing information that they claim is classified.
Right. And Shannon, there's questions whether this is now a criminal investigation. Is it a national security investigation? Where do we go from here, assuming maybe we never get a chance to see the affidavit?
Yeah, we might not. But what we do know is on the face of this warrant, what it says is you can go after any physical documents or records constituting evidence, contraband, fruits of crime, or other items illegally possessed in violation of. And then it has the different sections, which are gathering and transmitting or losing defense information, concealment, removal, or mutilation of government documents. There are all kinds of there are 3 different statutes that are outlined here, and they have real criminal implications. If you were convicted under these statutes, some of them 3 years in jail, 10 years in jail, one's up to 20 years in jail. These are serious allegations. They are the justification for the warrant. And until we see those underlying affidavits, if we ever do, or if the government decides to move forward with some kind of case, we're just not going to know what that's based on. But these are real federal statutes with real criminal penalties.
Of course, I'm not sure what the binders of photos, the handwritten notes, and maybe the information from the president of France, if it's covered on any of those things. But Jonathan, there was also a report, Washington Post, talking about nuclear materials or nuclear information. The whole thing has now become just a wild game of speculation. How important is it that the DOJ and the AG somehow reel this in? I mean, it seems like the ball is in their court to remove some of this, because this sort of speculation hanging over this nation can't be good.
Well, that's what really highlights what we don't know. TSSCI is a very high classification. If there was classified material in the former president's possession, he was not allowed to have that material after he left the presidency, and the government has every right to retrieve that material. But there are a lot of questions, not just about the status of the material, but the knowledge of the former president. And then you have all of these leaks that are being attributed to the Justice Department. And that's one of the reasons why it's not an easy thing for an attorney general to order the release of an affidavit. But this is a unique, historic moment. And whether for good or for bad, this raid has caused a great deal of concern among citizens, in fact, a belief among many, that this is just another targeting of Donald Trump. That hurts the entire legal system, not just the Justice Department, FBI. It really undermines the rule of law. And so this is an occasion where the Attorney General needs to go against what I think is his personal inclination and to say, release it. Release the affidavit. Let's show what there is here. Now, by the way, the Department of Justice could just say, just shrug and say, we got the documents back. We're going to be giving some back to him, but we achieved our purpose. If that's the case, we might never see, or might not, we actually might never see the affidavit itself. But there are crimes being alleged in this affidavit and in the warrant against a former president of the United States. And that person is the expected opponent of the current president of the United States. It is ridiculous to ignore the troubling aspects of that situation. And I think Attorney General Garland's got to do much, much more than the type of boilerplate statement that he made yesterday.
Shannon, I mentioned a Donald Trump tweet. Former President Trump also added that they could have had at any time this information they wanted, and it includes long ago. He says all they had to do with that was ask. But there's another part to this. The bigger problem is what they are going to do with the 33 million pages of documents, many of which are classified, that President Obama took to Chicago. Earlier today, Martha played three sound bites together of James Comey on the information that Hillary Clinton had on her server, and he concluded that it was extreme carelessness in handling top secret information, but added, we cannot find a case for bringing criminal charges on her, despite the fact that it was extremely careless and she did have these top secret documents. So are we looking at a different sort of legal precedent here?
I think that the optics of this are very difficult for the FBI and the DOJ. And all of us on this panel will remember when this was going on with the former Secretary of State, she was allowed to go in on a weekend with her lawyers, go in and talk to the FBI. It was not recorded. It was handled in a way that a lot of people thought was different than most people would be in facing these questions. And it's the optics of this, especially as Professor Turley has pointed out, that are going to be really difficult for the DOJ, for the Attorney General, for the FBI, because people see this and perceive there's a difference in the way that these cases were treated, that people were treated, that it gets to the dangerous place of worrying about partisan perception or politics entering into these institutions, that as Americans, we don't ever want to have to doubt them. But people can easily point to these other cases that were very high profile and say, how come the treatment has been so different? I mean, there are political ramifications of this, and it's naive to think that this would have been done in a low-key way. That Newsweek reporting, which again, we don't know about the sourcing on it, but it points to senior DOJ officials and says they thought they could do this in a low-key way. I don't know how anyone thinks that you can carry out a raid on a former president's house and a warrant that's based on federal criminal statutes and think that it's going to go under the radar.
Right. Or why this sense of urgency? Why stop negotiating? Why not issue another subpoena? Again, take extraordinary care to show the public that we made sure this was the absolute only way we could do this. And so far, they haven't been able to do that. And Katie, I want to ask you, because there's a general feeling that all of this was just a pretext, the National Archives and now some of the information coming out, to seek additional information, particularly maybe to aid with the J6 committee, which feels like it's losing a lot of its steam.
Well, of course, that's the suspicion. I don't think that the DOJ is going to be sloppy enough to not make some case that the warrant was based on what they're claiming it is, which is these classified documents. And if in the course of searching those areas, they come across evidence that helps another case for the January 6 allegations, then they can, in fact, use that if the search was executed properly. So I don't think we'll ever really get an answer to that in terms of, is this a pretext? Probably. I mean, I'm sure they're hoping that they come across other information that's helpful. I wouldn't be surprised by that. But I think that this warrant signed off by the judge does allege a crime that's not related to January 6 issues. But again, this is very political. It's incredibly political. Merrick Garland did nothing to quell any concerns that this is some unique justification for doing this to a former president. And again, I go back to my point that any comparisons to other government individuals, even at the highest levels, possessing classified information is not comparable to the president or a former president of the United States.
Jonathan, yesterday there were reports the White House had no idea that A.G. Garland was going to have their press conference. The White House had no idea about the raid. When should we expect to hear the White House really seriously chime in on this?
I don't expect any time soon. This is one of those occasions where the advantage is to be out of the loop, although they appear to be in the minority given all these leaks from the Justice Department to major media about every aspect of this case. It seems like the White House is the only people who are not getting insider information. But, this is obviously kryptonite for the Biden administration because of the optics that we have discussed. But they need to come forward, I'm talking about the Justice Department, and really show an airtight and undeniable case presented in front of that magistrate. Anything that is short of that is going to fulfill the narrative of critics of the Justice Department. This could not be more serious, not just for Donald Trump, but as I said, for the justice system itself. And Merrick Garland seems to be absent without leave on this. I was surprised by his statement yesterday. He talked about one aspect outside of the documents with regard to his approval. He didn't swat down the suggestions this could be a pretext for January 6th. He didn't address some of these other sort of procedural or scheduling issues. Now, he is someone who is known not to be inclined to reveal information, but he's the Attorney General of the United States who just ordered a raid on the former president's home and the very likely opponent of the current president. There is no way you could reproduce that in any past historical event. He's really in unknown territory, and he has to do better than to simply say, trust us, we're the government.
Yeah. Thank you, team, very much. That was fantastic, and we appreciate it. Thank you very much. And again, Shannon, congratulations. So,
hi, everyone. I'm Brian Kilmeade. I want you to do me a favor. I want you to click to subscribe to the Fox News YouTube page. This is the only way that I know for sure that you're not going to miss any great commentary, any great news bites, any great interviews coming your way on Fox. You can get it all here on YouTube. So subscribe right now.